The frost had ceased being merely cold, it had transformed into something malevolent, a living predator that coiled around her flesh like spectral chains, stealing whatever heat remained in her weary bones. It clung everywhere, adhering to her. Cracked azure skin, weaving through the silver strands of her matted hair, and filling the narrow passage with deathly stillness, Lyria had lost track of time since arriving here. Hours, perhaps days, blurred together when existence became a war of attrition. She sat pressed against the frigid brick wall, arms wrapped protectively around her two young ones. They represented her final motivation to continue breathing, the last fragments of a life that had been torn from her grasp. Yet even now, as she held them close, their small forms shook uncontrollably in her embrace. Cale, barely past toddlerhood, pressed his face into her chest, his tiny fingers clutching weakly at her threadbare jacket. He was too cold, far too cold. His skin, once a brilliant shade of azure, had faded to something pale and lifeless. His silver hair, so reminiscent of his father's, was crystallized with ice. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his words barely audible whispers. "Mother, I don't want to feel cold anymore." A broken sob lodged in her throat. Davin, her elder child, was curled against her side, his small hands gripping her arm. His lips were cracked, his silver hair tangled from the harsh wind, and his once vibrant emerald eyes had dimmed from exhaustion. He was attempting to be brave, he always did, but she could feel how his thin frame trembled. He had stopped weeping hours ago. Now he simply pressed himself against her, silent and shivering, as if willpower alone could prevent the cold from seeping into their bones. They were dying. Lyria clenched her jaw, forcing herself to sit straighter despite the agony in her frozen limbs. She couldn't allow this to happen, not to them. She had been wandering the streets of Caldris, the human settlement, for days, searching for someone, anyone who might help them. But the world remained indifferent. Once, she had possessed a home, a partner, a life that, while imperfect, had belonged to her. Then Torvin was gone, claimed by a senseless accident that left her widowed. In her culture, a widow was nothing. The Zephyrians believed in strength, in survival at all costs. Those who couldn't provide, those considered weak, were cast out. A woman without a mate, burdened with two helpless children, she was worse than nothing. She was a liability. She had pleaded, begged, but no one listened. No one cared. They had seized her home, stripped her of everything, and abandoned her in the cold with nothing but her children clinging to her hands. That was how she had ended up here, in this city of towering metal and flickering lights, surrounded by a species not her own. The humans were strange, reckless, unpredictable, but they were also something her own people were not. They cared. She had witnessed it, humans sharing their food with strangers, sheltering the vulnerable, helping those who had nothing. That was why she had come here, despite the fear, despite everything she had been told about them. But no one had noticed her. No one had stopped. She was losing hope. A gust of wind hauled through the alley, sending another wave of biting cold through her body. Cale whimpered. Davin tightened his grip on her arm. Then a door opened. The sudden burst of warm light spilled into the alleyway, and for a moment, Lyria barely registered what she was seeing. A man, a human, stepped outside, shaking snow from his heavy coat. His broad frame filled the doorway, his dark hair dusted white from the snowfall. His breath emerged as mist, his movements slow and tired, as if he had performed this routine countless times before. Lyria's breath caught a chance. Before she could move, Davin pulled away from her grasp. The boy stumbled forward on numb, unsteady legs, his small feet barely able to carry him through the thick snow. His voice, cracked from cold and exhaustion, still managed to rise above the wind. "Please." His emerald eyes were wide, desperate. "Please help my mother. She's too cold, she can't." His words choked off into a sob. The human froze, his sharp gray eyes locking onto Davin, then shifting past him to land on the huddled form of Lyria and Cale. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the man moved. In seconds, he was kneeling before them, pulling off his thick insulated coat. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his face, something that flickered behind his eyes. Not just surprise, not just concern, recognition. "I understand," he muttered under his breath. Without hesitation, he wrapped his coat around Lyria's shoulders. The warmth was overwhelming, almost painful against her frozen skin. She gasped, her body instinctively curling into it. "Hey, stay with me." The man's voice was rough, low. "Can you hear me?" She tried to speak, but all that emerged was a shaky exhale. Then, before she could protest, he scooped her up into his arms. She barely had the strength to react. For the first time in what felt like forever, warmth seeped into her skin, chasing away the numbing grip of the cold. His arms were strong, solid, as he held her against his chest. His heartbeat was steady, grounding. Cale let out a weak whimper, reaching for her. The man turned to the children. "Come on." His voice softened, but there was no room for argument. "You two, hold on to me." Davin grabbed the fabric of his jacket without hesitation, his frozen fingers clutching desperately. Cale, too weak to stand, whimpered again but didn't let go of Lyria's coat, and just like that, they were no longer alone. As the man carried them inside, away from the merciless cold, Lyria's mind swam with one last thought before exhaustion claimed her. "Please don't let this be another cruelty." Warmth enveloped her like a long-forgotten embrace, seeping into her frozen skin, dragging her back from the numbing void. Lyria's first instinct was to resist. Warmth meant vulnerability, meant lowering her guard, but her body, exhausted and weak, refused to fight. Instead, she sank into it, her aching muscles releasing the tension they had carried for far too long. A dull throbbing spread through her limbs, the slow return of feeling, both a relief and a cruel reminder of how close she had been to slipping away. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she tried to pull herself from the heavy fog of exhaustion. Then she felt it, soft fabric beneath her fingertips, thick and unfamiliar. The air around her was no longer sharp with frost but thick with heat, a stark contrast to the brutal cold that had been her companion for days. She wasn't outside anymore. Lyria's eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment, the dim glow of artificial lights blurred together in a haze. She forced herself to focus, blinking away the lingering haze of exhaustion. The room around her was small but filled with warmth, a soft couch beneath her, a worn blanket draped over her body. The scent of something unfamiliar human lingered in the air, along with the faint aroma of something warm. Panic flared in her chest. Her children. She tried to sit up, her body protesting with every movement. But before she could do more than shift, a voice cut through the silence. "Hey, take it easy." Her head snapped toward the source of the voice. The human. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his sharp gray eyes studying her with something unreadable. His dark hair was still dusted with the remnants of snow, and the heavy coat he had given her was missing, leaving him in a simple fitted shirt that stretched across his broad frame. Lyria's heart pounded as she tried to push herself upright. "Where?" Her voice cracked, her throat raw from cold and disuse. She swallowed hard. "Where are my children?" A flicker of something crossed his face, understanding, maybe even regret. Without a word, he stepped aside, revealing a sight that nearly brought her to tears. Davin and Cale. They were bundled together on a thick rug near a small heat source, wrapped in blankets far too large for them. Davin was sitting upright, watching her carefully, his emerald eyes filled with something between relief and weariness. Cale, too weak to stay awake, was curled into his brother's side, his tiny hands still clutching the fabric of the oversized blanket. They were safe. Lyria exhaled sharply, her chest tightening with something dangerously close to gratitude. "They're all right," the man said, his voice softer now. "They were freezing, but I got them warmed up, gave them some soup." The little one didn't eat much before he passed out, but the older one, Davin, right? Her eyes snapped to his. He remembered their names. Davin hesitated before nodding. The man, Marcus. She remembered Davin calling him that, sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I know you're probably freaking out, but you're safe here. I don't know what the hell happened to you three, but I wasn't about to let you die in the snow." Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. Her people had told her she was worthless, that no one would want a widow with two mouths to feed, that even if she went to the humans, they would turn her away. Yet here she was, in the warmth of a stranger's home, wrapped in his coat, her children sleeping under his roof. She studied him, her instincts screaming for her to be cautious. Humans were unpredictable. Even the kind ones had limits. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Marcus blinked, then let out something between a laugh and a sigh. "What do I want?" He gestured toward the couch. "Lady, I just spent the last hour making sure you didn't freeze to death. If I wanted something from you, don't you think I would have asked by now?" Lyria flinched at the sharpness in his tone. He wasn't wrong. Marcus ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling slowly. Look, I get it. You don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either if I were in your position. But you were half dead, and your kids weren't much better. You needed help. The simplicity of his words unsettled her. No one did anything without expecting something in return. Humans were different. But were they that different? She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her mind racing. She needed to regain her strength. She needed to think. Marcus shifted on his feet before sighing again. All right, you probably don't want me hovering, so I'll give you some space. He nodded toward the kitchen. There's more soup if you need it. You don't have to eat, but I'd recommend it. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't bracing against the cold. She wasn't running. She was sitting in a warm home, her children safe beside her, and she had no idea what came next. Lyria's first conscious thought was warmth, not the fragile, fleeting kind she had stolen from the children by holding them close, nor the numbing fire of a body too cold to feel anything at all. No, this warmth was real, solid. It wrapped around her thick and unrelenting, pulling her away from the icy void she had nearly slipped into. Her second thought was fear, her body tensed instinctively, her fingers twitching beneath the heavy fabric draped over her. This wasn't the harsh, frozen alley where she had huddled with her children. The air was different, thicker, warmer, filled with the scent of something unfamiliar. Something sharp, like burnt wood mixed with the faintest trace of metal, where panic surged, sharp and immediate. Her hands shot forward, searching, desperate, small fingers curled around hers. Mother. The voice was soft, hesitant, but it shattered her fear like fragile glass. Her vision cleared, the fog of exhaustion lifting just enough for her to see David kneeling beside her, his silver hair still tangled from sleep, his emerald eyes wide and searching. His small hands gripped hers tightly, his fingers barely warm, but no longer trembling. She exhaled shakily, squeezing his hand. I'm here, my love. David nodded, but his grip didn't loosen. He leaned in slightly, his movements careful, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Lyria's gaze flickered past him, searching for the smaller form she knew had to be there. Kale. The little one was curled up on a thick rug near a strange metal device that radiated heat. He was a tiny bundle wrapped in a massive blanket, only a mop of silver curls visible from beneath the fabric. For a moment, she just stared at him, overwhelmed by the sight of his chest rising and falling steadily. The words settled deep in her chest, heavier than any weight she had carried before. She was still processing it when the blanket shifted, and a small face peeked out, groggy and confused. Kale blinked sleepily, his round cheeks still flushed from warmth, his lips parting in a tiny yawn. He looked around the room, then at her, his little brow furrowing in the way it always did when he was thinking very hard. Then suddenly, as if only just realizing where he was, he gasped dramatically. Oh no, he blurted, sitting up so fast the blanket fell from his shoulders. His small hands grabbed at it in a panic, yanking it back up over his head like a hood. Mother, I lost my warm. David groaned beside her. You didn't lose it, Kale. You threw it off. Kale gasped again, scandalized. No, I didn't. It ran away. The absurdity of it was so familiar, so them, that for a moment Lyria could do nothing but stare. The past weeks had stolen everything from them, their home, their safety, even the smallest joys of childhood. And yet here was Kale, fighting with a blanket as if it were a mischievous creature that had betrayed him. Her throat tightened. Kale finally won his battle with the fabric and swaddled himself again, peeking out with big, expectant eyes. Mother, do we get to keep the warm place? Lyria hesitated. I don't know. Kale's expression crumpled. But it's so good, Mother. It has the hot thingy and the soft thingy. He grabbed a fistful of the oversized blanket and held it up like a prized possession. This thingy, it smells like, he sniffed it dramatically, like a person, a big person. David buried his face in his hands. Kale, that's because it belongs to a big person. Kale gasped for a third time, his eyes going round, his little mouth forming a perfect O. Did we steal it? Before Lyria could answer, a deep voice cut through the room. No, kid, you borrowed it. Lyria turned sharply, her entire body going rigid. Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind. He looked different in the warm light, less harsh, more human. His dark hair was still tousled from sleep, and his expression was unreadable as he took them all in. Cale ducked back under the blanket like a startled creature, only his bright eyes visible through the folds. Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Figured you'd be up soon. He glanced toward the kitchen. Made coffee. Don't know if you're kind. Drinks it, but it's hot. Lyria didn't respond. She was still studying him, still trying to understand what he was. People did not help without expecting something in return. They did not give food and warmth and safety freely. Marcus must have something in mind. Marcus must have noticed her hesitation because he sighed, shaking his head. Look, I get it. You don't trust me. You don't have to. He nodded toward the boys. But you're not in the snow anymore, and neither are they. So maybe, instead of looking at me like I'm about to kick you out, you should focus on the fact that you're alive. Lyria flinched not at his words, but at the weight of them. She lowered her gaze to her hands, still trembling slightly from exhaustion. Her people had left her to die. They had said no one would take her in. Yet here she was. Davin shifted beside her, still watching Marcus cautiously. Can we stay? He asked, his voice small, uncertain. Marcus sighed again, rubbing his jaw. Look, kid, I'm not throwing you out, all right? But I don't exactly run a boarding house either. I need to know what I'm dealing with. His gaze flicked back to Lyria. So what am I dealing with? Lyria stiffened. This was at the moment everything could fall apart. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. My people do not care for the weak. Marcus didn't react. He just waited. When my mate died, she continued, her voice steady despite the sharp pain in her chest, I was cast out. It is tradition. A widow without a bondmate is considered worthless. A widow with children is even worse. Cale let out a tiny sniffle from under his blanket. Marcus's jaw tightened, his gray eyes flicking back to the boys, lingering on them before returning to her. So they just abandoned you? She nodded. A slow, bitter laugh escaped him. Hell of a system. She had nothing to say to that. Silence stretched between them. Then, without a word, Marcus turned and walked toward the kitchen. A moment later, he came back with a steaming mug. He set it down on the table beside her, stepping back. I don't know what kind of messed up world thinks throwing out a mother and her kids is normal, he muttered, crossing his arms. But I do know one thing. You don't deserve that. Lyria stared at the mug, at the warmth curling from the surface. Something inside her chest twisted. Marcus wasn't her kind. He wasn't bound by Zephyrian traditions or rules. He had no reason to care about them. And yet, he had given her warmth, given her children's safety, given her a choice. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the mug. The heat seeped into her fingers, chasing away the last remnants of ice. And for the first time in a long, long time, she let it. Lyria had spent most of her life learning to endure. She had endured the cold stares of her own people when her mate died. She had endured the slow unraveling of everything she once called home. She had endured hunger, exhaustion, and the bitter reality that no one was coming to save her or her children. She could endure. But they couldn't. Not Davin. Not Cale. And if Marcus chose to send them away, to push them back out into the freezing night, then all of this, all of the warmth, the brief reprieve, the illusion of safety would be nothing more than a cruel delay of the inevitable. Her hands trembled as she tightened the blanket around her shoulders, forcing herself to sit straighter. Her body still ached from the cold, but her mind was sharp now, clear with the single thought that mattered most. She would do anything to keep them safe. Marcus stood across the room, leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching her with unreadable eyes. His expression wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was cautious, calculating, as if weighing whether or not he had made a mistake by bringing them here. That terrified her. Davin and Cale were both awake now, though Cale was still wrapped up in the oversized blanket like a tiny cocoon. His sleepy silver eyes darted between her and Marcus, his little hands gripping the fabric tightly. He didn't understand what was happening, not fully, but he could sense the tension in the air. Davin, though, he understood. He sat quietly on the floor beside his brother, his small frame stiff, his emerald eyes locked onto Marcus as if he was preparing himself for the worst. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Look, he said finally, his voice low but firm, I'm not heartless. I wouldn't have brought you in if I was planning to kick you back out the second you woke up. But I need to know what I'm dealing with here. Lyria swallowed hard, her fingers tightening into the blanket. Marcus exhaled sharply. I don't even know your name." For a moment, she hesitated. Names had power among her people. To give someone your name was to offer a piece of yourself. But what choice did she have? "Lyria," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Marcus nodded, as if testing the sound of it in his mind. "All right, Lyria. You said your people threw you out because of some messed up tradition, right? And now you're here, in a human city. Hoping for what? A miracle?" There was no cruelty in his tone, but there was skepticism. He had no reason to believe in her, in them. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "I hoped for kindness," she admitted, "but I have learned not to expect it." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Lyria took a slow breath, steadying herself. "If you wish for me to leave," she said carefully, her voice unwavering, "I will. I have survived this long. I can continue to do so." Kale made a small, distressed noise, but she kept going. "But my children, they cannot survive out there." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "I can endure, I can suffer, but they cannot. If you must send someone away, send me, not them." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with desperation and something even stronger, a mother's resolve. Kale scrambled out of his blanket cocoon and crawled into her lap, pressing his face against her chest. "Mother, no," he whimpered, clutching at her with tiny, trembling fingers. "Don't go away." Davin didn't say anything, but his hands balled into fists, his small shoulders trembling. Marcus's expression darkened, his grip on his arms tightening, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked angry, not at her, at the world, at the fact that she even had to say those words. He pushed off the counter and ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Jesus," he muttered. Lyria's breath hitched slightly, but she said nothing. Marcus let out another sigh and shook his head. "Damn it." He turned away, pacing for a moment before finally stopping and looking back at her. "You really thought I was just going to toss the kids out into the cold?" Lyria hesitated, but she nodded. "I do not know you, and I have seen what people are capable of." Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "I guess I can't blame you for that." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, he let out a sharp breath and shook his head. "Fine, you can stay, all of you." Kale perked up immediately, his silver eyes wide with hope. "Really?" Marcus shot him a look, then sighed. "Yeah, kid, really." Kale gasped dramatically, then turned and launched himself at his brother. "Davin, we get to keep the warm place." Davin, despite everything, let out a soft, breathless laugh. "I told you it wasn't going to run away." Lyria's entire body sagged with relief, though she forced herself to remain composed. Marcus rubbed his temples. "God, what am I doing?" he muttered. Then he pointed at her. "I'll figure something out, but don't expect this to be permanent." Lyria nodded, even though she wasn't sure she believed him. Nothing was permanent, but for now, her children were safe, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet. Lyria had spent so long fighting, bracing herself for rejection, for the inevitable moment when she and her children would be cast out again. But the moment never came. Marcus didn't say much, but he didn't push them away either. He went about his daily routine, moving through his home with a casual efficiency, as if he hadn't unexpectedly taken in 3 frozen strangers from the street. He never asked for anything in return, never demanded explanations. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She had been raised to believe that survival always came at a cost, that no one gave something for nothing. But Marcus, he simply existed alongside them, as if their presence wasn't an inconvenience. Lyria didn't know what to do with that. She remained cautious, wary of the unspoken terms of this fragile arrangement. She kept to herself as much as possible, cleaning up after the children, making sure they stayed quiet and out of the way. Every time Marcus left the house, she half expected him to return with someone who would demand they leave, but he never did. And slowly, tentatively, the weight of constant fear began to lift. Kale, of course, was the first to settle in. Despite everything he had been through, her youngest had a boundless capacity for joy. He explored their new surroundings with wide-eyed wonder, treating every unfamiliar object as a grand discovery. The first time he saw the glowing blue interface panel on Marcus's wall, he gasped so loudly that Davin nearly fell over in shock. "Mother." Kale scrambled onto the couch, pointing frantically. "The wall is glowing. It's magic." Davin, ever the realist, rolled his eyes. It's tech, Kale. You've seen tech before, not human tech, Kale argued. Then he turned to Lyria with wide silver eyes. Mother, can I touch it? Lyria was about to answer when Marcus, passing through the room with a cup of coffee, cut in dryly. If you want to shock your tiny hands off, sure, go for it. Kale yelped and immediately yanked his hands behind his back, his eyes even wider than before. He scurried back to Lyria's side, grabbing her sleeve. Mother, the wall bites. Marcus snorted into his coffee. Relax, kid. It won't actually shock you. Probably. Kale was not convinced. From that moment on, he regarded the glowing panel with deep suspicion, occasionally glaring at it as if daring it to attack him. Lyria didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She had spent so many nights cradling Kale's frail, shivering body, terrified that he wouldn't wake up the next morning. Now he was arguing with household technology, pouting at the mean wall like it had personally wronged him. It was such a painfully normal thing for a child to do. Davin, on the other hand, remained cautious. While Kale adapted with the fearless curiosity of the young, Davin lingered at the edges, always watching. He followed Lyria's lead, always staying close, always ready to leave if needed. Marcus noticed. You always this quiet, kid? He asked one evening, glancing at Davin over the rim of his coffee mug. Davin tensed slightly, as if the question itself was a trap. Marcus arched a brow. Sure seems like it. Davin frowned, clearly unsure if this was an insult or an observation. Marcus shrugged and leaned back against the counter. Nothing wrong with being quiet, he said casually. Just means you're thinking. Smart people think before they talk. Davin blinked, thrown off by the unexpected compliment. Then slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. Lyria watched the exchange in silence, something unfamiliar curling in her chest. Her people did not praise silence. Among the Zephyrians, silence was weakness. Hesitation was failure. But Marcus, he didn't see it that way. She wasn't sure how to feel about that. She wasn't sure how to feel about him. Marcus was complicated. He could be gruff and impatient, but not in a cruel way. He had a sharp tongue, but there was no real malice in his words. He moved through life as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders, yet he never once hesitated to help when it mattered. And he never touched her. It was something she noticed early on. He never reached for her, never invaded her space. He kept a respectful distance, even when he didn't have to. She had spent so long being treated as a burden that she wasn't sure what to do with a man who seemed entirely uninterested in forcing something from her. And yet, despite his distance, he watched. She caught him doing it more than once, watching, assessing. His gaze was careful, unreadable. Not like a man waiting for something, but like a man trying to understand. That, more than anything, made her uneasy, because if he was trying to understand, it meant he cared. And caring led to things that could not be undone. She should have left. She should have gathered her children and run the moment she had the strength to do so. Staying meant risk. Staying meant trust. But the thought of taking Davin and Kale back out into the cold, of losing this fragile, impossible warmth, was enough to keep her frozen in place. She wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. Marcus didn't press her for answers. He didn't ask what her plan was, didn't demand explanations for things she wasn't ready to say. But one night, as they sat in the dim glow of the kitchen lights, he finally spoke. You're not used to this, are you? Lyria looked up from her untouched cup of tea. Used to what? Marcus gestured vaguely. Being somewhere safe. She swallowed hard. She could have lied, should have, but instead she said, no. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he said, you should be. The words settled in her chest like a weight, heavy, unfamiliar. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could, but as she looked across the small, cluttered kitchen at Kale curled up on the couch, at Davin reading silently by the dim glow of the room's light, she realized something terrifying. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to stay. Lyria had spent her life preparing for the worst. She had learned long ago that happiness was fragile, that safety was temporary, that no matter how warm a place might feel, there was always a moment when the ground beneath her feet would vanish and she would be left scrambling to hold on to what little she had left. She had survived because she had never allowed herself to hope too much. But here, in this small, cluttered home, this place that smelled like human coffee and the faint scent of metal from old machinery, hope was creeping in despite everything. and it terrified her. She watched Kale as he played on the floor, giggling as he dragged one of Marcus's worn-out blankets around like a cape. Davin sat nearby, carefully examining a small puzzle cube Marcus had given him, his brow furrowed in concentration. They looked content. Not fully healed, not yet, but no longer shrinking into themselves, no longer clinging to her in fear of the world outside. Marcus had given them that, and now she had to decide what came next. Marcus had said they could stay, but he had also made it clear this wasn't a permanent arrangement. He wasn't throwing them out, but he wasn't exactly setting up a future for them either, and that meant she had to find a way to secure one herself. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. Late one evening, after the children had fallen asleep, she found Marcus at the small workbench near the back of his home. The space was cluttered with tools and half-repaired equipment, machines she didn't recognize, parts she couldn't name. He was hunched over one of them, sleeves rolled up, fingers deftly working through tangled wiring. She hesitated at the doorway. "You fix things?" Marcus glanced up, surprised to see her there. "Yeah," he said, setting down his tool. "It's what I do." She stepped further into the room, studying the devices scattered across the table. "For work?" "Something like that," he muttered. "Not exactly a traditional kind of job. I do repairs, some tech work, a few side gigs when things get slow." He leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly. "Pays enough to keep the place running." Lyria hesitated before speaking. "I want to work." Marcus raised a brow. "Come again?" "I need to provide for my children," she said, her voice steady. "If we are to stay here even for a short time, I will not be a burden." Marcus frowned slightly. "It's not," he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, it's not like I'm asking you to earn your keep. You and the kids aren't a damn inconvenience, all right?" Her fingers curled at her sides. "That is not how my people see it." He exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, your people sound like real bastards." Lyria flinched. Marcus studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You got any skills?" Lyria lifted her chin. "I was a ship engineer. Before." She trailed off, but Marcus understood. Before everything fell apart. Before her people left her for dead. His brows lifted slightly. "An engineer?" "Yes." Marcus let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. "Well, you're probably more qualified than I am." She hesitated. "Would that be useful to you?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he sighed and gestured toward the half-repaired device on the table. "You tell me. Think you can fix this?" Lyria stepped forward, her hands hovering over the machine. It was different from the technology she was used to, human-made, more compact, more rugged, but she could still understand its purpose. A power module, fried wiring, minor corrosion on the internal circuits. Her fingers twitched with the instinct to reach for the tools. She looked at Marcus. "If you allow it, I will try," he smirked, handing her the tool in his hand. "Be my guest." She took it, the weight of it familiar in her grip, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like herself again. The next morning, Davin stared at her in wide-eyed awe as she worked at the table, carefully dismantling and repairing the device. Marcus had given her. "You're fixing it," he said, creeping closer. "Yes," she murmured, carefully replacing a damaged connector. His eyes gleamed with something that made her heart ache. Pride. Kale, of course, had a different reaction. "Mother's fixing the human stuff," he cheered, throwing his hands in the air. "Mother's magic." Marcus, who had just walked into the room, snorted. "She's not magic, kid. She's just smart." Kale turned to him, completely serious. "Smart as magic." Marcus paused, then surprisingly, he nodded. "Yeah, guess you're right about that." Lyria focused on her work, pretending not to notice the warmth in her chest. By the end of the day, the power module was fully repaired. Marcus tested it twice, grunted in approval, then leaned against the table, arms crossed. "All right, you're officially better at this than I am." Lyria raised a brow. "I assume that means I am hired?" Marcus smirked. Yeah. Don't let it go to your head." But something had shifted. This wasn't charity anymore. It wasn't temporary. It was something real. She had a place here not just as a mother desperately trying to keep her children alive, but as something more. Someone with value. Someone with purpose. And as she watched Davin tinker with a small gadget Marcus had given him, as she listened to Kale chatter excitedly about his new theories on magic wires, she realized something terrifying. She had found something she never thought she'd have again. A home. and this time, she would fight to keep it. The air between them had changed. Lyria felt it in the smallest moments, the way Marcus's eyes lingered just a second longer when he looked at her, the way his voice softened when he spoke to the children, the way he stood just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without ever touching her. She had ignored it at first, convinced herself it was nothing, but it was there, constant, unspoken, and it terrified her. She had spent so long holding herself together, making herself unbreakable for her children. She had built walls so high, so strong, that even she had started to believe they were unshakable. But Marcus had a way of getting past them without even trying. She had seen it in the way he treated Davin, offering him quiet, steady reassurance without pushing him. She had seen it in how he handled Kale's endless curiosity, responding with teasing patience instead of exasperation, and she had felt it deeply in the way he looked at her. Not like she was a burden, not like she was something broken, but like she was something worth saving. It made her breath catch in ways she didn't understand. Tonight, the house was quiet. The boys had fallen asleep curled up together on the couch, the flickering light of an old hollow screen casting faint blue shadows across their faces. Lyria stood at the small kitchen sink, washing out the cups they had used earlier. The warm water ran over her hands, grounding her, giving her something to focus on, something other than the man standing behind her. Marcus was leaning against the counter, sipping from his ever-present cup of coffee. He had been watching her for a while now, not in a way that felt threatening, not even in a way that felt intentional, but she could feel his gaze, steady and thoughtful, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd picked up. "You don't have to do that, he said finally, nodding toward the dishes. Lyria dried the last cup and set it aside. "It is only fair," Marcus snorted. "Fair? You do realize I basically got a free mechanic out of this arrangement, right?" She turned to face him fully. "And you got a mechanic who cleans." His lips twitched slightly. "Can't argue with that." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with something she couldn't quite name. Marcus set his cup down, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're different," he said suddenly. She tensed. "Different? Yeah," he said, watching her closely. "When you first got here, you were, I don't know, always ready to run. Like you didn't really believe this was real." Lyria lowered her gaze. "It did not feel real," Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. And now she had Kale curled up in a pile of blankets, dreaming without fear. Now she had Davin looking at her with something other than quiet, exhausted resignation. Now she had warmth and food and safety and Marcus. Something inside her tightened. "I do not know," she admitted. Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if trying to read between the words. Then, to her surprise, he took a step closer. Not much, just enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to meet his eyes. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. The words sent a tremor through her, small but undeniable. She wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. Lyria swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay still even as every instinct told her to step back. "I do not know how to exist like this," she whispered. Marcus didn't move, didn't push, but there was something intense in the way he held her gaze. "Then learn," he said simply. She hated how easy he made it sound. She hated how much she wanted to try. The space between them felt smaller than it had before. Marcus's gaze flickered just for a second to her lips, and something deep inside her stirred. It was unfamiliar and terrifying and warm, and she didn't know what to do with it. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, he pulled away. Not out of rejection, not out of hesitation, but because he was giving her space. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Marcus picked up his coffee, acting as if nothing had happened. "Get some sleep, Lyria," he said, his voice lighter now, less intense. "Tomorrow's another long day." She nodded, but as she watched him walk away, she knew something had changed, something she could no longer ignore. It started in the smallest moments. A glance held a little too long, a touch that lingered just a second past what was necessary. The way Marcus would look at her across the room when he thought she wasn't paying attention, as if trying to piece together something he couldn't quite grasp. And the way she felt when he did. Lyria wasn't naive. She had known love once. She had felt the quiet certainty of belonging, the deep comfort of another's presence, woven so seamlessly into her life that it had become part of her. But that had been before exile, before she had been made to believe that love was a luxury she could no longer afford. Now, every instinct she had told her to be careful, to hold herself at a distance, to not let this man settle too deeply in her heart. And yet here she was, standing in his kitchen, watching the way the warm glow of the overhead light softened the sharp lines of his face as he leaned against the counter, sipping his ever-present cup of coffee, and wondering how she had let him become so much more than just a stranger who had saved her life. Marcus exhaled, setting his cup down with a quiet clink. "You keep staring at me like that. I'm going to start thinking you're planning something." Lyria blinked, heat rushing to her face. "I was not," she stopped herself, pressing her lips together. Lying would be pointless. He always saw through it. Marcus smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Not what?" She turned back to the dishes, focusing intently on the task as if it could erase the moment. "It is nothing." Marcus let out a low chuckle. "Sure doesn't look like nothing." She shot him a glare over her shoulder, but he just grinned like he was enjoying whatever game this had turned into. Lyria huffed and turned her attention back to the water running over her hands. It was ridiculous, really. She had spent years enduring far worse things than a human with a teasing smile. But it was not just a smile. It was the way he looked at her like she was something to be figured out, not discarded. It was the way he didn't hesitate to step between her and danger, even when the danger was nothing more than an unfamiliar world pressing in around her. It was the way he made her feel safe, and that terrified her, because she knew, deep in the quiet, unspoken part of herself, that if she let herself have this, it would be something she could never undo. Marcus stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that she felt the warmth of him at her back. Lyria stiffened, not in fear, never in fear, but because she wanted. And wanting was dangerous. His voice was quieter when he spoke this time, closer. "Lyria." She swallowed hard. She didn't turn around. If she did, she wasn't sure what she would find in his expression. Or worse, what he would find in hers. "I'm not expecting anything from you," he said, as if sensing the storm inside her. "You don't owe me anything." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the weight of those words. Her people had never given without expectation. No one had ever given her kindness without a price attached, but Marcus had. She turned then slowly, letting her gaze meet his. His gray eyes were steady, patient, like he would wait forever. If she needed him to, that was the moment she realized she was already his. Somewhere in the night spent at his table, the mornings spent in quiet companionship, the way he had cared for her children without hesitation. She had given him something she hadn't meant to, a piece of herself she was afraid to lose. She was afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing had settled between them. Marcus, as always, just waited, and then, slowly, cautiously, she reached for him. It wasn't much, just her fingers brushing against his, a touch so light it barely existed. But he felt it, and instead of pulling away, he curled his fingers around hers. Solid and warm and real. A slow exhale left him, like he had been holding his breath, waiting for her to choose. And she had. She didn't know what this meant. She didn't know how to navigate the tangled, fragile mess of emotions that had taken root between them. But she knew, in that moment, that she wanted to try. For the first time in a long, long time, she wanted more than just survival. She wanted him. Lyria never thought she would know happiness again. She had expected survival. She had hoped for safety. But happiness? That had been too much to dream of. Yet here she was, sitting at the small kitchen table, watching as Kale and Davin bickered over a pile of mismatched tools, their silver hair messy from sleep, their laughter bright and full. Here she was, in a place that no longer felt borrowed. Marcus stood at the stove, lazily flipping something in a pan, his broad frame relaxed in a way she had rarely seen. The smell of something warm and vaguely sweet filled the air. Pancakes, he had called them. She had never had them before. Kale, on the other hand, was thoroughly convinced that pancakes were the single greatest achievement of human civilization. "Marcus, hurry," he whined dramatically, collapsing onto the table. "I'm starving," Marcus scoffed. "You ate an hour ago." But that was so long ago. Kale rolled onto his back, arms spread wide. "I'm wasting away," Marcus smirked. "You're dramatic. That's what you are." Lyria tried to suppress a smile as she watched them, but Marcus caught it. His gray eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, Something warm passed between them, something unspoken, something that didn't need words. She looked away, heart pounding. It had been weeks since she first reached for him, since she had let her fingers brush against his, testing the boundaries of something she hadn't allowed herself to want. And Marcus had let her take her time. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. But he was always there, steady as the ground beneath her feet. At first, it had been small things, his hand brushing against hers when he passed her a tool, the way his shoulder would press lightly against hers when they sat together after long days of work. Then there were the nights. Nights when exhaustion pulled her under too fast to fight it, and she would wake in the dim glow of the kitchen to find a blanket draped over her shoulders, the warmth of it still clinging to his scent. Nights when she would find him sitting beside her, silent but present, watching over her as if making sure she wouldn't disappear. And then, one night, she had reached for him. Not just his hand, but him. She had curled against his side, her body tense, uncertain, waiting to see if he would pull away. He hadn't. He had let her rest against him, his arms settling around her waist with a gentleness that made something in her chest ache. And just like that, something shifted between them. Now, it was no longer just stolen glances and quiet touches. Now, when Marcus passed her in the hallway, his hand would skim the small of her back, brief but deliberate. Now, when she sat beside him, he would lean into her just enough for their shoulders to touch, their warmth bleeding into one another. Now, she was no longer afraid to want him, and he was no longer waiting for permission. Marcus set a plate of pancakes in front of her, interrupting her thoughts. Here, try them before the kid eats the whole stack. Kale sat up instantly, gasping. Are they ready? Marcus rolled his eyes. Yeah, they're ready, you little gremlin. Kale cheered, and immediately grabbed one, nearly toppling the plate in his excitement. Lyria picked up her fork, carefully cutting off a small bite. The moment the soft, sweet flavor hit her tongue, she blinked in surprise. Marcus smirked. Good? She nodded, swallowing. It is strange, but not unpleasant. Kale looked horrified. Mother, it's not strange, it's delicious. Marcus chuckled. See? The kids got taste. Lyria shook her head, but the warmth in her chest only grew. This was theirs. This messy, imperfect, beautiful thing they had built together. She had spent so long believing she had no future, that she was nothing more than a woman trying to survive, trying to keep her children from being swallowed by a world that did not want them. But now she had something worth staying for. And as Marcus sat beside her, his knee brushing against hers, his gaze lingering just long enough to make her breath catch, she knew she had found something she would never let go of again. She had found home.